It happened on a day so hot the air itself seemed to tremble. I hadn't planned on being there. Truth is, I was only passing through that god-forsaken town, just looking for water, a fresh horse, and maybe a stiff drink to wash the road dust from my throat. But fate has a way of laying snares where you least expect them. The shouting caught my ear first. Sharp, mean voices drifting over sun-baked boards and drifting dust. I might have kept walking. God knows I should have, but curiosity's a stubborn thing. I followed the noise down a narrow alley that smelled of sweat, old wood, and desperation. And there, crowded into a makeshift yard between two warehouses, was the ugliest sort of commerce I'd ever laid eyes on. A slave auction. Men and women stood packed around a low wooden platform. Atop it, 3 men in ragged coats held a girl by ropes so tight her bronze skin was already raw and bleeding. Her hair fell loose and black as midnight, tangled around her face, and though her chest rose and fell with quick, ragged breaths, she stood without bowing her head. Her dark eyes swept the crowd, daring anyone to look back. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I had my own ghosts to worry about. And yet, then I saw it. Peeking from beneath the torn strap of her rough dress, half hidden by dirt and sweat, was a tattoo. Black ink spiraling into the shape of a bird mid-flight. My feet rooted to the spot. The sun felt suddenly hotter, the air tighter in my lungs. I knew that mark. 5 years ago, out in a desert that had no name, I'd seen it burned into the hand of the man who'd saved my life. A tribal chief whose words I couldn't understand, but whose kindness had meant everything. That man had dragged me from death's doorstep, given me water when I'd had none, and turned back to his camp without asking so much as my name. And now, by some cruel twist of fate, I was staring at the same mark on this girl's shoulder. The auctioneer banged his gavel, snapping me back. "Starting bid, $5, he barked. $5. For a living, breathing soul. The crowd jeered. "Hell, she ain't worth that much," someone laughed. I didn't think. I didn't weigh the cost or the danger. My mouth moved on its own. "5, I called out. Heads turned, laughter dying in a breath. The auctioneer blinked, spat in the dirt, and shrugged. Sold. My boots felt heavy as I crossed the boards to the platform. The coins in my hand felt like lead. One of the men shoved her toward me, the ropes still burning red lines into her wrists. Her gaze met mine, sharp and wary. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw something else there. Surprise, maybe recognition, but it vanished before I could be sure. We stepped off the platform together. The murmurs behind us followed like flies. "What's he want with that cursed thing? Fool don't know what he's bought. She'll bring him nothing but death." Maybe so. But I'd walked away from too many debts in my life. This one, I wouldn't. I steered her down a side alley, the wooden boards creaking under our weight. The sun beat down on us both, turning the dust to powder that clung to skin and breath alike. When the noise of the auction finally faded behind us, I stopped. She didn't speak. Neither did I, at first. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, dark and unblinking. "You know why I bought you?" I finally asked, my voice lower than a prayer. A breath caught in her chest. She shook her head. "5 years ago," I said, "your father saved me. Out in the desert, half dead. Gave me water. Kept me breathing." Her lips parted, cracked from thirst, but strong all the same. "You remember him?" "I do." For a long heartbeat, the walls of that alley, the heat, the noise of the town, all of it seemed to fade. It was just us, and the memory of a kindness neither of us could repay. And that was the moment I knew. I hadn't just bought her freedom. I'd bought myself a fight. The sun had started to slip behind the rooftops by the time we reached the edge of town. Neither of us spoke on the way. Dust curled around our boots, and the wooden boards underfoot creaked like tired bones. I could feel the weight of every stare that followed us, pity from some, suspicion from others, and quiet hate from a few. Folks in towns like this had no patience for strangers, and even less for debts paid to people they considered cursed. Outside a leaning stable that smelled of sweat and old hay, I untied my horse, a rangy dun mare that had carried me farther than any friend ever had. The girl kept her distance, her wrists still raw from the ropes. I offered her water first. She took the tin cup in both hands, and though they trembled, she drank slow, careful not to spill a drop. Dust had painted her face in lines of exhaustion, but her eyes stayed sharp, watching me. "What's your name?" I asked finally. For a moment, I thought she might refuse to answer. Then, in a voice rough as gravel but steady all the same, she spoke. "Okay." I let the name settle on my tongue. "I'm Wes," I told her. "We don't have to trust each other, but we do have to ride together. Understand?" She gave a single, tight nod. Trust would come later, if it came at all. I swung into the saddle, then held a hand down. Onoke hesitated, dark eyes narrowing, weighing something silent in her mind. Then she took my hand, climbed up behind me, and settled in with her hands light against my belt. The touch of her palms was a reminder. She was real, alive, and with me, for now. We rode out of that town with the sun bleeding gold across the rooftops. Behind us, the auction yard faded into dust and memory. Ahead lay open desert, a wasteland of rock and thorn scrub that stretched until it swallowed the sky. I didn't know then what waited for us beyond that horizon, only that it was ours to face. By the time night fell, the heat had fled, replaced by a creeping cold that cut through cloth and bone alike. We made camp beside a dry wash where the moon turned pale rocks silver. I gathered what deadwood I could find, and coaxed a small fire to life. Onoke sat across from me, silent, her hands cupped around the flame as if to warm memories as much as flesh. When we finished eating, hard tack and jerky that tasted of salt and years, she finally spoke. "You didn't have to buy me," she said, her voice low, the words tasting of smoke and doubt. "I know," I said, "but I owed your father a debt. A real one." She looked at me through the shifting shadows. "That debt was to him, not to me." "Maybe so," I admitted. "But here we are." A silence settled between us, heavy as the desert night. The fire crackled, throwing fleeting shapes on stone walls. And then, as if prying open an old wound, she began to tell me why she'd stood on that auction block. "They came at night," she whispered. "Men with guns, faces wrapped in cloth. They demanded gold, horses, things we didn't have. My father refused. So they took us instead. Me and my sisters." Her voice hardened, like a blade honed on grief. "I broke free once, but they caught me. They killed my father before my eyes. Sold me cheap to be rid of me. My sisters, Kiona and Misu. I don't know where they took them." Each word felt like a stone dropped into a well with no bottom. I kept my eyes on the fire, but inside something coiled tight, a promise unspoken. "We'll find them," I said. "You don't know these men," she answered, her voice raw. "No," I said. "But I know what it means to owe your life to someone, and I know what it means to have nothing left to lose." She didn't argue. That was answer enough. When the fire burned down to coals, we lay wrapped in our own silence under a sky cracked open with stars. The desert around us was so quiet I could hear the beat of my own heart, steady but stubborn. Morning came with wind and dust, sweeping away the last warmth of night. We broke camp before the sun rose high, Onoke gathering her dress close for warmth. Her eyes scanned the horizon constantly, as if she half expected death itself to come riding over the dunes. We didn't talk much as we rode. Words felt heavy, and the road ahead was long. By noon, we'd left all sign of town life behind. Only the wind spoke now, whistling across sand and stone. At a dry streambed, Onoke slid from the saddle and knelt, running her fingers through the dust. "Look," she murmured. I followed her gaze. Hoof prints, fresh. At least a dozen horses, maybe more. The tracks cut west, toward the Badlands. "They're moving fast," she said, "but not careful. They think no one dares follow." I felt a grim smile tug at my mouth. They're wrong. We trailed them through the heat of the day. The land grew harsher with every mile, jagged rocks and gullies ready to break horse legs and necks alike. But Onoke read the ground like a map only she could see. A broken branch here, a scuffed stone there. Each clue whispered to her, and she whispered it to me. By dusk, we reached a rise overlooking a wide, shallow canyon. Smoke curled upward, thin and grey, from a camp below. Through a veil of twilight dust, I counted wagons, horses, and men moving about with lazy confidence. Too many for comfort. But in the center, tied to a weathered post, two shapes huddled together. Even from that distance, I knew. "They're alive," I breathed. Anoki's shoulders shook, just once. Relief or rage, I couldn't tell. "Kiona and Misu," she said. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned bright. I put a hand on her shoulder, feeling the muscle tight with fear and hope. "We'll get them out." She nodded, her jaw set. "And then we end this," I said. The last light drained from the sky. Shadows stretched long and deep across the camp below. As darkness claimed the canyon, Onoke leaned close, her breath warm against the side of my face. "They don't expect anyone to come," she whispered. "That'll be their mistake," I answered. The fire below flickered. The men laughed, passing bottles and boasting about tomorrow's spoils. I knew we had one chance, wait until they slept, slip in like shadows, and cut the ropes before dawn. Anoki's fingers traced the handle of her knife, the spiral mark on her shoulder catching moonlight. In that moment, I saw her not as a girl sold for $5, but as a flame the desert itself had refused to snuff out. The desert night wrapped us in silence, but beneath that quiet, a promise pulsed with every breath. Come morning, we'd fight for more than freedom. We'd fight to settle an old debt, to right a wrong the world had tried to forget. And whatever hell waited in that canyon, we were ready to walk into it together. Night had swallowed the canyon whole by the time we moved. The fire below had burned low, casting more shadow than light. From our perch on the ridge, the camp looked almost peaceful. But I knew better. Peace is a lie men tell themselves before dawn breaks the truth. I checked my rifle one last time. The weight felt right in my hands, familiar as regret. Onoke crouched beside me, her blade flashing silver in the moonlight. The wind whispered over the rocks, tugging at the feather in her hair. She didn't look at me, but I felt her breath steady, slow. Fear was there, yes, but so was something stronger, purpose. We descended the narrow goat trail, boots sinking into sand that muffled each step. Below, the outlaws had begun to drift toward sleep. Some still muttered by the dying fire, bottles slipping from slack fingers. Others had already wrapped themselves in blankets, guns close at hand. Men who'd stolen daughters, burned homes, and murdered fathers, and now dreamed untroubled dreams under a sky too wide to care. The canyon walls rose around us, ancient and silent, as if they too held their breath. We moved from shadow to shadow, the scent of smoke and horse sweat thick in the air. My pulse drummed loud in my ears, each beat a warning we might not leave this place alive. The sentry sat slumped against a boulder, his hat tipped forward, a bottle balanced between his knees. Onoke didn't hesitate. Her knife kissed his throat, and the breath left him in a wet whisper. She eased him down, eyes never leaving the camp. We pressed on. At the edge of the wagons, the sisters were tied to a post, heads bowed, dark hair tangled and dull. Even from behind, I saw how their shoulders trembled with each breath. Onoke reached them first. Her hands worked quick, slicing the ropes. Kiona stirred first, eyes wide, uncomprehending. Then recognition flared, raw and desperate. Misu made a small sound, half sob, half prayer. Onoke hushed her with a touch, fingers brushing her cheek. No words. Just a promise passed from sister to sister. But promises can't change fate. A bottle clinked against stone behind us, the sound sharp as a pistol crack. One of the men rolled over, blinking blearily into the darkness. His gaze landed on us, confusion turning to alarm. For half a heartbeat, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Then he opened his mouth to shout. My knife flew before I knew I'd thrown it. The blade buried in his chest, cutting the warning short. But the silence shattered. Another man stirred, then another, and then the canyon roared to life with curses and gunfire. We ran. Bullets bit stone and sand around us, sparks dancing in the dark. I grabbed Misu by the arm, hauling her behind a wagon. Onoke dragged Kiona close, her eyes wild but focused. A man lunged around the wagon, pistol raised. I fired from the hip. He fell, the shot echoing through the canyon walls like judgment. Go! I barked. Onoke and the sisters sprinted toward the path that led back up the ridge. I covered them, lever working, each shot a prayer whispered in powder and lead. Another outlaw crumpled, then another. But there were too many. By the time I turned to run, 2 men had cut me off, knives gleaming. My rifle was empty. I swung it like a club, catching one across the face. He dropped with a grunt. The other lunged, blade flashing for my throat. Pain lanced across my shoulder as I caught his wrist. We grappled in the dust, boots slipping. His breath smelled of rot and whiskey. He was stronger, but desperation gave me teeth. I drove my forehead into his nose, felt cartilage break under bone. His grip slackened. My hand found my sidearm, and I fired once, the barrel pressed to his gut. He folded, and I shoved him aside. Gunfire still cracked behind me, shouts echoing against rock. I stumbled up the path, lungs burning, the sisters ahead of me, Onoke glancing back only once to make sure I followed. Her eyes found mine, and for a heartbeat, relief softened her face. Then we were moving again, the climb steep and cruel. Gravel slipped underfoot, boots finding purchase only to slide again. Behind us, the outlaws scrambled up, gun barrels glinting in the thin moonlight. At the top, I turned, dropped to one knee, and worked the rifle's lever with practiced fury. The canyon funneled them into a narrow line. I shot the first man off his feet. His scream was brief. The second hesitated, but Anoki's blade found him before he could aim. He toppled back into the others, buying us a heartbeat. "We have to go," she called. "Go," I shouted back. "I'm right behind you." We fled into the desert, hooves pounding when we reached the horses. Misu and Kiona clung to each other, eyes wide and haunted. Onoke swung up behind them, pulling them close. I mounted, blood soaking my sleeve from the knife wound, and turned the mare's head east. "Ride," I growled. We thundered into the night, bullets whining past, the canyon shrinking behind us until it was nothing but shadow and memory. The desert opened before us, cruel but free. We rode until the moon climbed high and my arm felt numb with pain. Only when the sounds of pursuit faded did we slow, the horses lathered and blowing hard. We stopped beside a dry wash, the sisters sliding from the saddle to huddle together, weeping in relief or fear. I couldn't tell. Onoke stood a few feet away, staring back at the horizon where Devil's Cut lay hidden in darkness. Her shoulders rose and fell, breath ragged, but she stayed silent. I joined her, the wind cooling the sweat on my neck. "We got them out," I said. Her voice was low, almost broken. "But it isn't over. They'll come for us." I nodded. "And we'll be ready." For a moment she looked at me, truly looked, and I saw the girl who had stood on that auction block, refusing to bow her head. Then her gaze hardened. "They killed my father. They burned my home. I won't run forever." "I don't plan to," I answered. The sisters slept curled together under a threadbare blanket. The desert wind tugged at Anoki's hair, lifting the feather in slow, mournful dance. Dawn would come soon, cold and sharp as a knife, and with it, the men who hunted us. But as I looked at Onoke, her dark eyes lit by stubborn flame, I knew something had changed. We weren't prey anymore. Come morning, we'd be the hunters. The desert at dawn was a cruel teacher, cold enough to bite the bone, yet already promising the furnace of midday heat. We had barely slept, each of us stealing restless moments against the rocks, ears straining for hoofbeats that never came. Yet the fear of pursuit lingered heavier than any saddle. When the first light spilled across the sand, I rose stiffly. My arm throbbed from the knife wound, the sleeve stuck to the crusted blood. Onoke was already awake, perched on a boulder, scanning the horizon. The sisters stirred beside the dying embers of our fire, dark hair tangled, faces pale with exhaustion, but alive. "We can't stay here," I rasped, voice cracked from dust and silence. She didn't turn. "I know." The horses grazed what little dry brush they could find. They were as spent as we were. Their flanks heaved, ribs rising and falling like blacksmith's bellows. But they had carried us through Devil's Cut and out the other side, and they'd have to carry us farther still. I knelt beside the sisters. Kiona's eyes, older than her years, met mine without flinching. Misu clutched her arm, her gaze flicking to the wound on my shoulder, then away. "Are they coming?" Misu whispered. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. But they'll be slower. They've got wounded. And they don't know this land like we do." Her lips parted, but Kiona squeezed her hand, quieting her before words could bloom into panic. Onoke slid down from the boulder, boots whispering in the sand. "We ride," she said. "Devil's Hollow isn't far. It's narrow ground. If they come, they'll have to come single file." Her voice was sharp, but I heard the fatigue hiding behind it. None of us had strength to fight an army. But maybe we wouldn't have to. Maybe we could outthink them. "Then we ride," I agreed. We packed what little we had, a crust of bread, a cracked water skin, a few rounds of ammunition. The sisters mounted up, Kiona in front, Misu clutching her waist. Onoke and I took the other horse. My arm burned with every tug of the reins. As we set off, the morning sun broke free of the horizon, spilling gold across the broken earth. But there was no warmth in it for us. We moved slow at first, saving the horses' strength. The land rolled out in low ridges and dry washes, dotted with stubborn brush and ancient stones. Each mile felt heavier than the last, the weight of pursuit pressing on our backs. By mid-morning, We reached Devil's Hollow. It was nothing but a scar in the earth, a narrow gorge carved by centuries of rain and wind. The walls rose steep and jagged, close enough that two riders couldn't pass abreast. It was death to enter if someone waited above with a rifle, and that's what we meant to do. We dismounted, leading the horses to a patch of shade. The sisters sat on a flat stone, legs trembling from the ride. I caught Mrs. staring at the cut on my shoulder, but she looked away quickly when our eyes met. Onoke moved among the rocks, studying angles, counting paces. "We'll set the first trap here," she murmured, half to me, half to herself. "Loose stones above the path. One shove, and they'll tumble." I watched her, the way her hands traced the rock, the way her eyes narrowed with thought. She wasn't just her father's daughter. She was becoming something else, something harder, sharper. "And the second?" I asked. She pointed farther down the gorge, where the walls leaned even closer. "We light a fire here. Smoke will blind them, force them to bunch together. And then we shoot," I finished. She nodded, the barest ghost of a smile crossing her lips. "We shoot." Hours slipped by as we worked. My wound ached with every lift of stone, sweat soaking my shirt until it clung like a second skin. The sisters helped as best they could, carrying smaller rocks, piling brush for the fire. Mrs. hands shook at first, but steadied as the sun climbed. At midday, we rested. The heat pressed down like a hand, and the desert shimmered with false rivers in the distance. Kiona offered me water from the cracked skin, her eyes careful, measuring. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, voice low. I hesitated, the words heavy on my tongue. "Because your father once saved me," I said at last. "And because I couldn't leave you behind." She studied me, dark eyes old and knowing. "And after? When this is done?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. Onoke spoke before the silence could swallow us. "After we bury them," she said, voice flat. "And then we ride south. Farther than they can follow." Mrs. lip trembled, but she didn't cry. The sisters leaned into each other, drawing strength from skin and blood. The sun dipped west, shadows creeping long across the gorge. We moved into position. I climbed to a ledge overlooking the path, rifle balanced across my knees. Onoke crouched lower, near the pile of loose stones. The sisters hid farther back, behind a fold in the rock. And then we waited. The wind sighed through Devil's Hollow, stirring dust and dry leaves. Sweat beaded on my brow, trickled down my spine. My heart beat slow, steady, every pulse counting the seconds. Then, at last, the sound came. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, like memory. Then louder, echoing off the stone walls. I raised the rifle, sighting down the trail. They rode hard, dust rising behind them. 8 men, maybe 9. Faces I recognized from the camp, bruised, bloodied, but unbroken. One carried a rifle across his saddle. Another had a fresh bandage on his arm. They didn't look cautious. They looked angry. Onoke met my gaze across the gorge. Her eyes were calm, cold as stone. She raised her hand, waited, then dropped it. I shoved the pile of stones. They crashed down in a roar of dust and gravel, the sound deafening in the narrow space. Horses screamed, reared, men shouted curses. 2 were thrown, crushed beneath the slide. The others pulled back, but the gorge offered no room to run. Onoke struck flint to brush, the spark catching, smoke billowing across the path. The men coughed, blinded, cursed us by name. In the swirl of smoke and dust, they became shadows. And I fired. The first shot caught a rider high in the chest, knocking him backward off his horse. The second missed, sparking stone. I worked the lever, the rifle bucking against my shoulder, each shot an answer to every cruelty these men had dealt. Beside me, Onoke moved like shadow, loosing arrows she had hidden in her pack. One found a man's throat. He toppled soundlessly. The fight was chaos. Smoke, screams, hoofbeats echoing off stone. A man clambered up the gorge wall toward me, pistol in hand. I swung the rifle like a club, caught him across the jaw. He fell back, landing hard on rock. In the end, only two turned to flee. Onoke leapt down, her blade catching the nearest across the belly. He dropped, breath bubbling red. The last man spurred his horse, desperate to escape. I raised the rifle, sighted his back, and fired. The echo died slowly, swallowed by the gorge. Silence rushed in to fill its place. Below, the ground was littered with the dead and dying. Smoke curled skyward, black against the pale afternoon. I scrambled down, breath burning in my chest. Onoke stood among the bodies, her knife slick with blood, chest rising and falling. She didn't look at me, only at the corpses. "It's done," I said. She shook her head, voice rough. "No, the leader isn't here. He's still out there." And in her eyes I saw it. This was no victory. This was only the road to the real reckoning. We turned away from the ruin we had made, back to the sisters who waited in the shadows. And together, we stepped into whatever waited beyond Devil's Hollow. Dust still clung to our skin, and the scent of smoke clung to our clothes as we left Devil's Hollow behind. The dead we left where they fell. There was neither time nor strength left in us for graves. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows that chased our horses across the broken ground. And in every shadow, I thought I saw pursuit. None came, but the silence felt as heavy as iron. We rode until the horses stumbled from exhaustion, then dismounted in a shallow wash where the dry earth had cracked into scales. The sisters slid from the saddle, legs trembling so badly Misu nearly fell. Onoke caught her, her hand gentle in that moment despite all the blood that still streaked her blade. I knelt to check my rifle, counting rounds. Only 3 left. My arm burned where the bandage had soaked through. The wound reopened in the fight. The desert had a way of showing you what you were made of, and how quickly you could break. Kiona sank onto a flat stone, drawing Misu close. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice raw. Onoke shook her head before I could speak. "No, the leader wasn't with them. He'll come. And he won't come alone." The words tasted like dust on my tongue, but they were true. We had cut off the snake's body, but the head still lived, and it would strike. Dusk settled cold around us, and we lit a small fire, more for comfort than warmth. Flames danced in the sisters' dark eyes, and for a moment I saw not fear, but a flicker of hope. We had brought them this far. But the road ahead was darker still. Onoke crouched beside me, her voice low. "There were men missing from the fight," she murmured. "I counted at least 4 who weren't there. Guarding him, I guessed. Or scouting us," she said. Her gaze swept the horizon. "He'll know by now what we did. He'll gather what's left and come for us." I nodded, throat tight. "Then we don't wait." She looked at me, eyes dark as the canyon at midnight. "We go to him." Night fell fully, the desert sky blooming with stars. The sisters slept fitfully, curled together for warmth. Onoke and I sat apart, backs to a boulder. The fire threw shifting shapes across her face, shadows that seemed to dance with old memories. "Tell me about your father," I said quietly. She was silent so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, "He taught me to track by watching hawks. Said they see what we miss. And he taught me to fight with a blade, never longer than my forearm, so it never slows my hand." Her gaze was far away, fixed on memories only she could see. When those men came to the village, he stood before them, unarmed, told them to leave. They shot him where he stood. I didn't even hear him fall over the screaming. The words hung heavy in the cool air. There was nothing I could say to soften them. So I said nothing. Just sat beside her, the fire crackling between us. After a while, she turned to me. "Why did you really buy me?" she asked. Her tone wasn't accusing, only tired, searching. "I owed a debt," I said. "And because I couldn't watch them drag you away. Not when I could stop it." She studied my face, as if weighing my words. At last, she nodded, and the silence settled back between us, not warm, but no longer hostile. When dawn painted the sky in bruised pink and dusty gold, we mounted up again. Our path curved south and east, toward the broken hills where rumor placed the bandits' stronghold, an abandoned mining camp known only in whispers as Blackstone. By midday, we reached higher ground, the broken landscape sprawling below us. And there, in the distance, smoke curled lazily into the sky, a campfire too large for travelers. Onoke pointed. There, she said. The sisters looked where she pointed, and Mrs. Fingers tightened on Kiona's arm. Fear, but something else too, a spark of resolve. We left the horses in a dry ravine, hidden among thorny brush. The four of us moved on foot, each step raising small puffs of dust that caught the morning sun. The heat bore down like a hand on our necks, sweat slicking our backs despite the chill of fear. The land fell away into a shallow valley, hemmed in by black stone cliffs. And there, scattered among rusted mining shacks and collapsed shafts, we saw them, men moving between wagons, horses tethered near a trickle of water. Less than a dozen, but enough to kill us all if we stumbled. Onoke crouched low, scanning their faces. "There," she breathed, her voice a razor. "The one with the scar across his mouth. He led them. He killed my father." I followed her gaze. The man stood apart from the rest, barking orders. Broad shoulders, coat patched and dusty, a rifle slung carelessly at his side. Even from here, I could feel the coiled violence in him. "Then he dies," I said. Anoki's eyes stayed fixed on the scarred man. "And the others?" "We do what we must," I said. "But he doesn't walk away." The sisters stayed hidden in a cleft of rock while we scouted the ground. Every step closer set my heart hammering harder. We had no plan beyond the blade in Anoki's hand and the few bullets left in my rifle. But sometimes that was all a reckoning needed. As the sun reached its cruel zenith, we circled to the rear of the camp. A fallen beam offered a narrow path onto a collapsed roof. From there, we could see into the center of the camp. The scarred man stood near the fire, talking to two others. His hand moved as he spoke, punctuating words with sharp gestures. Authority radiated off him like heat from stone. Anoki's hand brushed mine, her fingers cold. "When?" she whispered. I swallowed, throat dry as the desert around us. "Now," I breathed. She slipped away into shadow, a ghost in the ruin. My rifle felt heavy, the wood slick with sweat. I steadied my breath, sighted down the barrel. The moment stretched thin as spun glass. Then the scarred man turned, half his face visible in the harsh light. I pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The bullet struck him high in the chest. He staggered, eyes wide with surprise. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, reaching for weapons, eyes wild. Onoke burst from cover, her knife flashing silver as she closed the distance. One bandit lunged at her. She ducked low, driving the blade into his gut. He fell soundlessly. The scarred man, bleeding but alive, raised his rifle. Our eyes met across the space, and I saw recognition, or perhaps only hate. He fired. The bullet whined past my ear, splintering wood. I fired back, missing wide. Another man turned toward me, pistol in hand. Before he could fire, Onoke was on him, her knife rising and falling. Smoke burned my lungs. The world narrowed to shapes and noise and blood. I climbed down, boots slipping on loose rock, every step jolting my wounded arm. The scarred man had dropped his rifle, clutching his chest where blood blossomed bright against dust. But he still drew a pistol, staggering toward Onoke. She faced him, breathing hard, hair wild around her face. They stood a heartbeat apart. He raised the pistol, but her knife was faster. It plunged into his chest, buried to the hilt. For a moment, they seemed frozen, as if the desert itself held its breath. Then he crumpled, dust rising as he fell. Onoke stood over him, chest heaving, the knife slick and red. It was over. The man fell at Onokei's feet, blood pooling in the dust, dark as spilled oil. His last breath rasped out through clenched teeth, a final defiance that dissolved into silence. And then the canyon seemed to swallow every sound at once. No wind, no bird call, only the ragged thud of my own heartbeat echoing in my chest. Onoke stood over him, shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Her knife glistened wet in the midday sun, the blade shaking slightly in her grip. For a moment, I thought she might collapse. But she drew in a single steadying breath, wiped the blade on her sleeve, and turned to face me. Her eyes weren't triumphant. They were hollow, haunted by the price of vengeance. All around us, the bandit camp lay in ruins. Smoke curled from overturned pots. One man still twitched where he'd fallen, gurgling on blood before going still. Another had tried to crawl away, trailing a smear in the dust. Now he lay unmoving, face turned toward the cracked sky. The smell of burnt powder and blood clung to the air so thick it felt alive. I lowered my rifle, its barrel warm under my palm. My wounded arm throbbed, blood seeping anew through the bandage. The fight was done, but the pain had only begun. Onoke walked past the bodies without a word. She crouched beside the scarred man and studied his face, as if searching for something. I stepped closer, the dry boards creaking under my boots. "What now?" I asked, my voice raw from dust and shouting. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze stayed locked on the dead man, brow furrowed. Then, almost too quiet to hear, "He wasn't the only one. There are others. Men who helped burn my village, who took my sisters. This is just the first." Her words dropped into the stillness like stones into water, rippling outward until they settled into the air between us. Part of me had hoped that with this man's death, her vengeance would be complete, that maybe we could turn away from blood. But revenge rarely ends with a single grave. Before I could speak, she rose, shoulders stiff. "We need to check the wagons," she said. Together, we moved through the camp, boots crunching over spent shells and shattered wood. One wagon was filled with sacks of grain and water skins, likely stolen from passing traders. Another held crates marked with faded brands, goods from settlements we'd never see. But it was the third wagon that made my breath catch. Inside, huddled under rough blankets, were 3 women and 2 boys, their faces streaked with grime, eyes wide with terror. Slaves, taken as plunder. One woman clutched a child so tightly his small face turned red. They flinched as we approached, shrinking into the shadows. "It's over," I said, my voice gentler than it felt. "You're free." They didn't move. Fear had bound them longer than any rope could. Onoke stepped forward, kneeling at the wagon's edge. She spoke softly in a language I didn't know, her words like water over stone. Slowly, hesitantly, the woman lowered her arms. The children peeked up, blinking through tears. One of the boys couldn't have been older than 10. His wrist bore the dark bruise of rope burns. His eyes met mine, questioning, frightened. I offered my hand. After a long moment, he took it. We led them out, one by one, into the hard light of day. The desert didn't welcome them, but at least it was no longer a prison. They stood blinking in the sun, ragged shadows of the lives they'd been stolen from. "They'll need food," Onoke murmured, "and water, and a place to go." I glanced around the ruined camp, counting what supplies were left. "They can't stay here," I said. "The trail will bring more trouble. Raiders, scouts, maybe worse." She nodded. Her gaze drifted to the horizon, where the heat shimmered like a living thing. "There's a settlement west of here," she said. "Small, but honest. They might help." We gathered what we could: dried meat, water skins, blankets. The horses that remained we untied, letting the freed captives climb into the wagons. One of the women, her voice little more than a rasp, asked where we would go. "To finish what we started," Onoke said, without looking back. And just like that, we turned our backs on them. We watched them vanish into the dust, 2 wagons bumping over the broken trail, children peering out from behind canvas flaps. Part of me wanted to follow, to find safety in distance. But safety was never what brought us here. The sun climbed higher, pressing down until sweat trickled in rivulets under my coat. We searched what was left of the camp. In the leader's tent, beneath a ragged bedroll, we found a map. Lines scrawled in charcoal marked routes through the canyons, trails I'd never ridden, names I didn't recognize. But Onoke traced a single mark with her fingertip, a black circle deep in the wastelands. "What is it?" I asked. "Stone's Mouth," she said. "A fortress built into the cliffs. That's where the rest will be." "How many?" She didn't meet my eyes. "Enough to finish us, if we go in blind." The map felt heavy in my hand. Paper and charcoal, yet it carried death in its folds. Dusk fell by the time we buried the dead. We didn't mark the graves. Men who lived by the blade rarely deserved stones to remember them. As darkness swallowed the camp, we lit a small fire away from the ruins, its light barely enough to push back the night. Onoke sat opposite me, her face hidden in shifting shadows. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The fire cracked softly between us, its warmth failing to reach the cold places inside. Finally, she broke the silence. "You could leave," she said, voice flat. "You've paid your debt." "I could," I admitted. "But you won't," she finished, her gaze meeting mine across the flames. "No," I said, because by then it wasn't just about debt. It wasn't even about vengeance. It was about her, and the sisters who still bore scars on their wrists. It was about a promise I'd made to a dying man years ago, and a promise I'd remade to his daughter in blood and dust. She nodded once, as if she'd expected nothing else. The night stretched around us, vast and indifferent. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes howled, voices rising and falling like ghost song. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and restless. Images haunted my dreams, the scarred man's dying stare, the fear in a child's eyes, Anoki's face lit by firelight, fierce and unyielding. Dawn arrived, pale and brittle, and with it the weight of what lay ahead. We packed in silence, leaving behind the ashes of the bandit camp. Ahead, The trail would lead us into stone canyons older than memory, to a place named only in whispers, Stone's Mouth. A fortress of rock. A den of killers. And the final chapter of this reckoning. We rode without speaking, two shadows moving against a sunburnt sky. The wind carried dust across our path, hiding old tracks and etching new scars into the stone. But Anoki's eyes stayed sharp, reading signs I could barely see. A snapped twig here, a scuffed stone there, breadcrumbs that led toward blood. By midday, we caught sight of it at last. Cliffs rising sheer from the desert floor, dark stone pitted and scarred by time. At their base yawned an opening, black as a grave and twice as deep. Stone's Mouth. I felt my chest tighten, breath catching in my throat. The end lay in there. Or our end. Anoki dismounted first, boots crunching on gravel. She ran a hand along the weathered rock, as if feeling for an old memory. "It's time," she said, without turning. And so we stepped into the darkness. The first step into Stone's Mouth was like stepping into another world. The sun vanished behind walls of jagged rock, and the air turned cool and damp, heavy with the scent of old earth and smoke. Shadows stretched long and deep, swallowing every sound we made until even our breathing felt loud. The path narrowed quickly, forcing us to walk single file. Loose gravel slipped underfoot, clattering into unseen depths below. Above, slits in the rock let in narrow blades of light, turning the dust motes into floating embers. I kept one hand on my rifle, the other brushing the canyon wall, its surface rough and cold. Anoki moved ahead of me, her steps sure, every muscle coiled with silent resolve. I watched the feather in her hair tremble with each breath. There was no room for words here, only the quiet promise of steel and vengeance. We found the first sign of them half a mile in, ashes still warm from a cooking fire, scraps of salted meat discarded in haste. Boot prints, too, some deep and fresh, others older, all leading deeper into the throat of the canyon. Each print felt like a heartbeat, drumming a warning. They were here, waiting. The canyon twisted left, then right, walls closing tighter until sky was nothing more than a thread above us. And then the passage opened into a wide basin carved by time and water, an ancient amphitheater of stone. In its center lay what could only be the fortress, a sprawl of crude stone walls, half-ruined towers, and tents clustered like scars on the earth. Smoke curled from within, rising pale against the rock. Figures moved along the walls, dark silhouettes carrying rifles and blades. A flag fluttered limply over the highest tower, black cloth marked with a single white handprint. The same mark I'd seen burned into the flesh of dead men we'd buried. I felt my mouth go dry. "That's them," I whispered. Anoki didn't speak. Her gaze locked onto the fortress, her eyes sharp and cold as a drawn blade. In that moment, I saw the girl from the auction yard vanish entirely, leaving only the daughter of a chief who'd lost everything. We crouched behind a fallen slab of rock, watching the sentries pace along the walls. Each step they took brought them closer to us, then away again, like the slow swing of a pendulum counting down to violence. My heart drummed a rhythm older than fear. Fight or die. Anoki turned to me, her voice low. "When night falls, we move. Inside those walls is the man who ordered my father's death. And we end this." I nodded. The shadows lengthened around us, swallowing the daylight, and the promise of blood hung heavy in the cooling air. Night was coming, and with it our reckoning. Night settled over Stone's Mouth like a black veil, smothering every edge and softening every sound. The fortress below turned into a patchwork of orange torchlight and restless shadows. Figures moved along the walls, voices drifting up to where we hid. Gruff laughter, the clink of metal, boots scuffing stone. Men at ease because they believed themselves untouchable. We lay flat on a ridge above, the rock cold under our chests. My breath misted in the chill air as I counted sentries, traced the paths they walked, and measured the pauses in their watch. Patterns emerged in the darkness, blind spots in torchlight, doors left half closed, guards whose eyes drooped as the night grew deeper. Beside me, Onoke watched too, silent as the stone itself. Her hand rested on the hilt of her knife, fingers drumming lightly, a rhythm of resolve rather than fear. The wind caught the feather in her hair, lifting it gently before letting it fall. Even here, on the edge of danger, there was something almost peaceful in her stillness. Far below, the campfire in the courtyard burned low, shadows stretching and swaying across the cracked walls. I wondered if the man we hunted, the one who gave the order to burn her village, slept somewhere inside those walls, oblivious to what crawled toward him in the dark. The wait stretched on, each minute slow as dying embers. Muscles stiffened, and fatigue nipped at the corners of my thoughts. But the promise that carried us this far burned brighter than weariness. Then Onoke moved, just a breath, but enough. "It's time," she whispered. We slid from the ridge, gravel whispering under our boots. Step by step, we descended toward the fortress, keeping to the deepest shadows where torchlight couldn't reach. A dog barked somewhere inside, and my pulse kicked hard in my throat. But no alarm followed, and the dog's bark faded into a low growl. Closer now, the walls loomed high above us, built of weathered stone patched with rotting wood. Decay spoke of arrogance, a belief that no one would dare strike at them. That belief would be their undoing. We reached the base of the wall where a crack ran through old mortar, wide enough for hands and boots. Onoke climbed first, her movements quick and sure, like a shadow made flesh. I followed, my fingers scraping stone, heart hammering with every upward pull. At the top, we lay flat again, breaths shallow. Below, the courtyard sprawled, half-ruined towers, a cluster of tents, and a central keep rising from the rock like a broken tooth. I could almost feel the weight of the man inside, the one whose death we had carried like a prayer through fire and dust. Anoki's gaze met mine across the stone, sharp and unwavering. Without a word, we dropped down into the darkened courtyard, and the hunt truly began. The courtyard was a maze of shadows and flickering torchlight, every step a gamble. Our boots made barely a sound on the cracked stone floor, but every instinct screamed that we were being watched. The scent of smoke and sweat hung heavy, mixing with something fouler, the smell of fear and death. Onoke led silently, her eyes sharp like a hawk's. I kept my rifle ready, though I knew the tight corridors and close walls meant it was more likely to be a knife fight. Every corner held the possibility of a waiting enemy, and every breath we took felt like a challenge thrown into the darkness. We passed half-ruined walls, overturned barrels, and tents ripped by wind. Somewhere off to the side, a faint murmur of voices drifted through a cracked wooden door. We paused, listening. Plans whispered, orders barked low. No doubt the lieutenants of the gang, unaware of how close death already crept. Onoke pressed a finger to her lips, signaling me to stay silent. She moved like a ghost to the door, her knife glinting faintly in the torchlight. With a swift motion, she slipped inside, and I followed, heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give us away. Inside was a small room, crowded with grim-faced men. The smell of stale alcohol and sweat was overwhelming. They were caught off guard, eyes wide as Onoke struck first. A blade flashed, a grunt, and the first man collapsed to the floor, eyes glassy. Chaos erupted, but the narrow room worked to our advantage. I fired twice, 2 more men down before they could react. Onoke moved like water, slicing through the confusion with deadly precision. We were out in seconds, hearts pounding, leaving behind bodies and broken commands. "We have to move faster," I whispered. "They'll be alert now." She nodded, voice steady despite the adrenaline. "He's close. The man who ordered the attack. I can feel it." The air grew colder as we ascended a narrow stairwell, the walls closing in like the trap they were. At the top was a heavy iron door, scarred with battle marks. Anoki's hand hovered near her knife's hilt. "This ends now," she said. I gripped my rifle tighter. Whatever waited beyond that door, it was the last step of a journey soaked in blood and shadow. We pushed open the door, and stepped into the final reckoning. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a chamber shrouded in shadows, but alive with a low flicker of candlelight. The room smelled of stale smoke and spilled whiskey, its walls lined with weapons, swords, rifles, knives, silent witnesses to past violence. At the center stood a man, broad-shouldered and tall, his face half hidden by the darkness. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto us the moment we stepped inside. The same eyes I'd seen in nightmares, the face burned into my memory from the stories Onoke told, the man who had torn her family apart. He smiled, slow and cruel. "So, the little bird and her cowboy come to dance," he sneered, voice low and venomous. "You think you can waltz into my home and take what's mine?" Onoke stepped forward, steady as steel. "This ends tonight. For my father. For my sisters. For everyone you destroyed." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the stone. Then he drew a pistol from his belt, aiming it with deadly precision. Time slowed. I raised my rifle, fingers steady on the trigger. But before I could fire, a shout burst from the shadows behind us. The chamber flooded with movement, figures lunging from hidden doorways, weapons drawn, a wave of enemies crashing in like a storm. Chaos erupted. Shots rang out, knives clashed, and the air thickened with the cries of battle. I fired blindly, every shot a prayer, every breath stolen by the fight for survival. Onoke was a tempest, her blade a flash of silver, cutting down foes with ruthless grace. I fought beside her, each enemy fallen a step closer to justice. Through the maelstrom, the man I hunted slipped away, disappearing into a hidden passage. Without hesitation, Onoke and I gave chase, hearts pounding, boots pounding stone. The narrow corridor twisted and turned, shadows swallowing us whole. Then, with a final surge, we burst into an open chamber, an altar of bones and broken dreams. The man turned to face us, his gun raised. But this time we were ready. I fired first, the bullet striking true. He staggered, eyes wide with shock. Onoke moved in, her knife finding its mark. He collapsed, silence flooding the chamber like a long-awaited dawn. Breathing hard, I looked at Onoke. We'd paid our debt, but the cost was written deep in the shadows of our souls. The fight was over, but the scars would never fade. The man's body hit the cold stone floor with a finality that echoed through the chamber. Silence settled around us, thick and heavy, like the weight of everything we had lost and fought for. For a long moment, neither of us moved, as if releasing the tension would break the fragile peace we'd just carved from chaos. Anoki's eyes searched mine, fierce but tired, the fire of vengeance finally dimming into something quieter. Relief, maybe even hope. I reached out, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, the same way I had the day I bought her from that cursed auction. Back then, it was a debt I owed her father. Now, it felt like something more, a bond forged in blood and fire. "We did it," I said, voice rough. "We brought them home." She nodded, voice low but sure. "For Kiona and Misu. For all of us." Outside, the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the stone walls, painting the world in soft gold. The city we'd run from seemed a million miles away now, replaced by a new horizon, one born from the ashes of pain and the promise of freedom. We gathered the sisters, faces pale but alive, clutching each other like lifelines. Their eyes held gratitude, but also a strength that told me this was just the beginning of their own journeys. As we mounted our horses and rode away from the fortress, the sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows that had haunted us for so long. I felt the weight of years lift from my chest, replaced by something lighter, hope. Not just for me, or Onoke, or her sisters, but for a future where debts were paid, and freedom was not just a dream. The road stretched out ahead, long and uncertain. But for the first time in years, I rode not as a man running from his past, but as one walking toward his destiny. We rode together into the sunrise, the echoes of the past fading behind us, and the promise of a new day lighting the path forward. If you were in his boots, would you fight the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other videos on your screen. There are more stories waiting for you.